I'd like to share with you 3 things that have shaped the way that I think about learning and are so important to me. The first of these is actually duct tape. I remember at the small age, my grandfather, it seemed, always had duct tape at the ready. And by the way, I believe my grandfather was probably one of the most creative and innovative people that I've ever met. But I remember that it didn't matter if we were fixing a car or changing a baby's diaper, it seemed that duct tape always had this ubiquitous utility. And I take that to this day. I just used it just the other day. The second thing is this. When I was in the 5th grade, my parents bought me a trombone. They also got me trombone lessons. And it was one of the most empowering situations that I've ever found myself in. Because here I was with this instrument and so curious about how to make it sound good and how to be able to perform well. And I remember that this has taught me so much of the power of artistry and creativity and learning. And then the third thing is this. When I was in the 7th grade, my mother and our family, as I might add, made the decision to go back to school. Only it wasn't just any school, it was medical school, and she was going to go be a physician. And I remember being old enough, the sacrifices and the trials and tribulations, but also the gratification and the celebration that we had, not only for her, but as a family of making that happen. And I remember the hard work that went into doing that, and I take with me that to this day. So for me, it was these 3 things, the duct tape, the trombone, and the doctor, that has framed so much of the way that I think about learning. And it's what I want to share with you today, for you to explore what these 3 things are for you, and to plot a course for what the future of learning is in our environments. If you're like me, most of when you think about a learning environment or education environments, you think of something like this, right? Desks in a row or chairs in a row. You go in, you listen to someone talk, and maybe you sort of stay awake through the class. I don't know. But for so many of us, this is what it's like. This is what my life was like. And I remembered I came from a family that was so supportive of education. I was not a first-generation college student, and I still struggled to connect with the learning environments around me, those spaces and places. And this was really what lit a spark in me in terms of the research and what the passion was that I have to help people learn. But people aren't just sitting in classrooms anymore, right? Almost a third of people are taking classes in some sort of flexible format, a sort of online or distance education. This is so different than what many of us have grown up doing and learning from. Then if we take this a little bit deeper, Generation Z, anyone guess what Generation Z, some of our youngest people in our classes or our teams are, what's their preferred learning platform? Guess what? It's YouTube. I'm guilty of this as well. If you try to, fix some plumbing, go to YouTube, right? And so for us, the nature of learning is changing. The nature of the learning environments are changing, and we have to be ready for these changes. So for me, this area of learning environment, or I call the spaces and places where people learn, is so pivotal and so fundamental to understanding how we solve the most fundamental questions that we face in our society. And so when I was growing up, I sat in classes that looked a lot like this. I'm sure you can relate to many of these things. The chairs were extremely uncomfortable. You put your books underneath the seat, and if you're lucky, you had one of those that were broken, and you could sort of like kick it with your foot a little bit, And so this environment was so ubiquitous. And it wasn't until I was in college that I realized that it didn't have to be this way. I remember I had an assignment, and the assignment was to deliver a workshop to my class. And so I went about planning the workshop, and I sort of thought to myself, this is sort of boring. How can I make this more engaging and more interactive for people? And so I thought to myself, well, what if I created a website? And at this time, that was kind of unheard of, right? You had to sort of like figure this stuff out. It wasn't easy like what you can do today. And so I taught myself to code. I don't have any formal training in that, but I ended up creating this website. And at the end of the workshop, I shared it with the class, and I said, guess what? Your learning doesn't have to stop here in this formal classroom. You can take it with you. And that was so revolutionary to them. So much so, I think the teacher too, because I actually ended up getting 150 out of 100. You go do the math in that, That still is my best grade to date, and I'll take that to the bank, right? But I remembered that this was such an incredible opportunity. Not only was I sort of rewarded with the grade, but I remember how fulfilled I was to rethinking the way that these learning environments actually happen. And at that moment, I didn't know it at the time, that moment ignited the spark that drove a lot of the research that I was doing. And so, sure, learning environments are all around us. They're certainly formal environments, but they're in coffee shops when we sit down and we learn from one another. They're maybe in online or mobile environments. They're in workplaces when you work with your colleagues. They're all around us, even in operating theaters where physicians are trying to figure out some of the most complex health problems that there are. But these learning environments are so ubiquitous, but yet we seldom think about the design of them in intentional ways. And this is actually the focus of where a lot of my research has taken me. There's an incredibly powerful connection between the environment and the experience. So if you think about, you go into a classroom, that environment is cueing the type of experience that you're getting ready to have. So much so if you go into a coffee shop, that's a different experience. And this relationship, again, is so powerful, but yet it drives so much of how we learn and how we focus. And so when I began to think about this, all the way back from my experience in college, you can think about learning environments in this ways, right? We have physical spaces, certainly, like the room we're in here, but there's virtual spaces. We have formal spaces where people are learning, and we have informal spaces. The problem is, so much of our focus and research and energy focuses in one of these quadrants. We focus on the physical environment, and we focus on the formal side of that. When in reality, when we start to think about new ways of helping people learn, we have to bridge this out. We have to think about, we have so many more tools at our disposal that we can help and help people learn. So for me, this was a story of a breakthrough. I began to think about how do we design better learning environments, that fundamental question, so that it wasn't just happenstance, but it was something that was intentional and purposeful. And going back to my experience when I got that trombone, I began to think of our role as educators, but what is our sheet music? Just like a musician would have a sheet of music to be able to share that music piece to someone else. What was our sheet music? Then begin taking this a little further. If you go from the perspective of an architect, what is our blueprint? How do we communicate these very fundamental things about how learning environments are designed? And the fact is, we don't have anything in education, or we didn't. And so for me, I thought to say, well, how do we create this language for designing learning environments and making it more successful and fundamental? But it wasn't just me. I had a great team and great collaborators on doing this. And this is actually it. This is the language itself. And what we do is we actually use this language to communicate the design of learning sequences and the design of those elements. And this is just one example. We actually found that when we think about technology-enabled learning, we think about things that are happening in an online space. But one of the first things we found to be so important and impactful is putting it on sticky notes. And I remember sitting at my house one day thinking, how do we really get this thing to catch off? I said, I wonder if we printed it on sticky notes, and came into the office the next day and we did it. And this was one of the things when working with people for the first time. Educators and teachers and managers and team leaders are able to see the learning environments that are around them, and they're able to be more intentional about these spaces and places where people are learning, whether it be in the business environment, education environment, or the classrooms. And this has been so effective that it's really allowed people to re-envision the way other people learn and to look at these things. And this is just a simple example of one of those. But it comes down to this. We took what was invisible. We took this sort of thing that you think in your mind, how I'm going to help people learn, or I'm going to design a class, and we made it visible. We made it concrete so that people can now interact with it, and they can connect with it in new and interesting ways. These are just a few other examples. You can do really simple blueprints, or you can do really complex blueprints, but at the core of it is communicating the intent and the design of the learning environment. But we didn't stop there. So we had this modeling approach, but we're also creating a suite of visualization tools that help people communicate some of the most fundamental questions that educators and leaders and managers face when they design learning experiences. What I think personally has been so interesting about this journey is that I started with myself, but it gave so many people around us for the first time an innovation canvas. Just like an artist would have a canvas to work on, this is the first time that educators have had that canvas to innovate and to bring forth creative ideas, dare I say revolutionary ideas in many cases. And so this has been such an exciting road for me, and such an exciting road for the people that I have the privilege of working with. And we're on this sort of innovation track of how do we re-envision and revolutionize the way way that learning environments are designed? Well, and we're starting with actually classifying them. For the first time, we now have a classification system that helps us to better understand the comparisons between different types of learning environments and what drives learning in the best ways in those spaces. We can profile them so that when you look at how you invest in a learning environment or how you plan a learning environment so that educators can be more intentional about that process. And then it's getting really exciting where we're able to use big data analytics, and machine learning to predict what types of learning environments are going to be more successful given certain situations. This is literally at the cutting edge, state-of-the-art nature of how we think about learning, and it's ultimately the design of the learning environments that shape how that happens. But for me, it's all about people. Whether it's a child sitting in a classroom trying to figure out that math problem, or whether it's a team trying to solve big problems at their work, things that they don't even know how to solve right now, but they know they have to. If you're a patient and you just encountered a new diagnosis, that's a learning environment that is probably every bit as more important, if not more, than anything else you'll find yourselves in. But it's fundamentally that learning process and the environments around us. And if you're an emergency responder, where learning has to happen on the snap, those learning environments, they matter so much at that moment. And so for me, it started with the duct tape, the trombone, and the doctor. I want to challenge you today. I want to challenge you to think about what your 3 things are. And I want you to think about how you work with others around you to revolutionize the spaces and places where people learn. Thank you.